Hello everyone. How to be with someone who survived childhood sexual abuse. That's the subject we're going for today. So this has been my year to tackle subjects which I have steered clear of. Cannabis, sugar, cancer. So, childhood sexual abuse. The reason I'm making this film is because it's become really clear to me that there's two kinds of people in the world. There's the people who have been sexually abused as children, which includes being raped, tortured and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that also would include things like satanic abuse. And then there's the people for whom that has not happened. And there's like this gulf between the two. That's your experience. You've no idea what it's like. So I'm making this film to bridge that chasm between those who have and those who haven't had this experience. So why? Why is it such a big deal? This is what I'm about to explain. If you've never experienced being raped or otherwise sexually abused as a child, then what I'm about to say is going to be a revelation. Because you won't have any clue. So okay, I've really laid it on thick, haven't I? So let's just get down to it. Sex is one of the most powerful creative activities that human beings and animals and some plants experience. Sex. It's amazing. It's how new life is created, and it's also the source of extraordinary pleasure, and it's called in magical traditions the great rite because there's a great deal of power to be mined through the creative act of being in love with someone, having sex with them. So if a child is sexually molested or raped or worse or much, much worse, what this does is it sets up a whole series of conditions in that person. And the first thing is called splitting or compartmentalization. So those of you who know me well through the films will know that I'm one of them. That's right, I'm one of them. I've got the t-shirt, I'm wearing it. So this means that because I've had that experience, that gives me the qualification to speak about this. If I hadn't, I wouldn't be able to. So if anyone speaks about childhood sex abuse who hasn't actually been through it, a bit difficult for them to be real, isn't it? So I can be totally real because this is my experience. So what happened to me is that the splitting took place. So this is the thing. I had the experience of getting to know an adult human being who then drew me into their confidence and got to know me well. And then when I was feeling open and vulnerable, and that was the moment that the advantage was taken of me. So what the person is experienced being raped or otherwise treated as a child experiences is this. They have an experience of life up until the moment it happens. And from the moment onwards, everything is different. And what has happened to that child is so horrifying that there is a strategy which the young human being employs, and this is how they survive. So anyone who's ever survived sexual abuse as a child has done so because they do this thing. So what they do is that activities that took place, which for them is completely freaking them out, it gets put into a box or a case or a bag or something, and it's put in a little compartment, and it's sealed off from all the rest of their experience. So what they experience now is two kinds of reality. One is everyday mundane reality, getting up, cleaning the teeth, having the breakfast and all those things, and then there's this other stuff that happens. Now, most children who experience sexual abuse, it doesn't just happen once, it usually happens many, many times. And if that's the case, as it is for me, what that means is that this need to compartmentalize these experiences is overwhelming. So all these experiences get put into this little box and they get put out of the way. And what we're doing is we're isolating those experiences so that we can actually function. If we don't do that, we're going to fall apart. And the thing that children learn very quickly, and I'm very sad to say this because this happened to me a long time ago, obviously, but this is happening to children today, right now, and unfortunately it's the same old story, which is that the way the perpetrator treats that child victim is they do a psychological mind game with them, which means that that child is absolutely certain they can't tell anyone. Because they can't tell anyone, they can't go to anyone for help, which means they can't get any help. And a few children that do attempt to get help usually get treated horrifically. So what the child usually learns, either the easy way or the hard way, is you don't tell anyone. So of course this reinforces the box. This is making it really strong. The box gets stronger and stronger, thicker and thicker layers of insulation between that event or those events and the rest of their experience. This is how they cope. This is how I learned to cope. This is how all people who've been through this cope. So the thing is, if you haven't experienced that, you won't have needed to create these strong boxes which hide these events in. Now what happened for me is I was bimbling along absolutely fine until my very late 30s. And that's because I could not possibly face what had happened to me before then. I was not ready. But around the end of my 30s, that became about the time when I was actually spiritually mature enough to be able to start to cope with things. So because this has happened, this means to say that these people who have had these experiences, there's a part of what happened to them that is tucked away in a box which they can't talk about to anyone because they got threatened. If they were lucky, they got threatened with their own death. If they were unlucky, they would get threatened with horrific things happening to their mothers and fathers and siblings and close friends. That's usually what happens. So they know they can't ever dare to say anything. So this is why the box becomes so strong and so secure. But what happens to pretty much everyone who's experienced this is there comes a point in their lives when these strong walls which they've created around these experiences start to break down and degrade. And that's when life starts to become really difficult, because it means they get their first inklings of weird stuff about themselves. And usually haven't a clue what's going on, they just know they feel weird. And in my case I ended up with a lovely chronic illness which lasted for 10 years, and that was my introduction to the breaking down of those walls. And eventually I got to find out what had been going on. Now for those of you who are more curious and want to know more, I recommend you go to my book. You can order it on Amazon, you can order the hardback or the paperback copy, or you can order the ebook. And at the end of this film, at the end of my films these days, there's a link so you can do that. And that will tell you exactly what was done to me. I'm not going to get caught up in any of this on this film because I'm more concerned about you understanding about the paradigm so that you can actually be with and relate to someone who's been through this. So you've got this clear picture, horrific things happen to this person as a child. They create these boxes where they confine everything. As the time goes by and they have more life experience, there eventually comes a point when they're spiritually mature enough to actually face up to what happened to them, and that's when the walls around the box start to degrade and they start to get fragmentary memories. Now this is usually pretty horrific for the person concerned. And remember, they weren't able to tell anyone as a child. The number of children that actually talk about this to any living being is infinitesimal. I want to really ram this point home to you. Very, very few ever get that luxury. And the ones that do, oh wow, they are so fortunate if they can find someone that actually doesn't give them more of a hard time, doesn't shock them, doesn't start abusing them. These things really do happen. That's why it's the thing you don't generally talk about. See? So here's a situation. The walls are breaking down and the person starts to become aware. So in my case it was going to the therapist. That was a key moment in the starting of the breaking of the walls down process. Plus actually spending a lot of time with a woman who'd experienced this herself and had actually been filmed in the days before video cameras. So there we go. So I'm finding this very difficult to talk about. I'm sure that's really obvious to you. I'm going to continue nonetheless. So now you know someone who's been through this process and they discover that was the case. And what often tends to happen is at first they want to talk about it incessantly, and then they go through a phase they don't want to talk about it at all or have anything to do with connecting with it whatsoever. And some of us, myself, Teal Swan and many others included, make this very important life choice, which is we choose to speak about it with others. And it's always the same. We always do this not for ourselves but for the bigger picture, because we want to help the world at large to understand. Now, the really big thing you've got to get hold of is there's a huge minority of people for whom this has happened. That's the first thing. So this is not an isolated, rare thing. Happening all the time. All the time is happening to huge numbers of people, a massive minority. Second thing you've got to get your head around, it doesn't just happen to girls, it happens to boys as well. Really important to grasp that. That was a really crucial challenge in my story, because I was at a point when I was coming out and wanting to get help, and what I discovered is there was help if I'd been a woman, because at that time people hadn't really woken up to the fact that it was happening to men as well, so there was no provision. So that was particularly tough. I was starting to become aware and wanting to understand what I'd been through and how it was affecting me. There was no help because I was the wrong gender. So there we go. Right. So you're in a situation that you have got a friend, or you're in a relationship with someone, or you've got a close friendship with someone, and they end up telling you one day, by the way, when I was a kid, these things happened to me. The first thing I want you to do is to realize that you've just been conferred a great honor. And I'm honoring all of you that watched this film, that got the courage to watch this film. I'm honoring every single one of you, because I'm choosing to share about this very intimate, personal, vulnerable thing about myself, which I've got a lot of feelings about. So here's the next thing. So number one is you've just been honored because the person is sharing with you. This is your friend, your lover, whoever, they're just sharing with you. This happened to them, so they honoured you. So when someone honours you, make sure that you respect them. Really go overboard on the respect angle. That really helps. Helps enormously if you can respect them at such a time. Now, the next thing that I want you to be aware of that's incredibly important is this may disturb you, what they've just shared with you. Now, one of the emotions, one of the prevailing feelings that this person will have carried with them from all the years since when it started all the way up until they're starting to speak about it, and they'll still be carrying it usually, and that's feelings of shame. Now, it's very hard, because surely why would a person who was abused sexually as a child carry any shame? Because it's obviously not their fault, because they're the kid. The adult did this thing to them, or the older child, the father, the brother, the family friend, whoever it was, the total stranger, whoever it was, they did this thing to them, so of course they've got nothing to be ashamed about, because they didn't do anything wrong, did they? Well, you see, you're looking at this from the perspective of a normal person, because you didn't ever get raped as a child, did you? If you're in that group of people. So it's very hard for you to understand that's what they'll be carrying. They'll be carrying a huge amount of shame. Usually a gargantuan amount of shame. And in fact, it'll take them a while to realise just how much shame they are carrying. So that's the second thing. So the first thing we just mentioned, which is they're honouring you, so be respectful. Second thing is they're carrying astronomical amounts of shame. So this comes to the third thing. The third thing is when you give them any kind of a listening, and when you make any comments about what they've been through, what you want to be doing all the time is to validate their experience. If someone comes out to you and tells you this stuff and you validate their experience, they are going to feel 100,000 times better. They're going to feel great. Because of course what happened to them as a child, think about it. The perpetrator did these things, they threatened them with death or death of loved ones or horrific experiences happening to loved ones. So they've just broken through these massive taboos. So imagine what it would be like if you were to dismiss what that person said, or in any way invalidate or belittle what they'd experienced. that would actually be a complete replay from their perspective of the abuse. So you wouldn't ever do that, of course. No, I know you wouldn't. What you would do is you would validate their experience. Let me break it down to you in case you don't know how to validate a person's experience, right? So if someone is talking to you and they're sharing these really personal, intimate things, then it would be really helpful if you give them some eye contact, but not too much. Just give them some eye contact, and if you're going to make any sounds or words, you're going to make those sounds or words things that sound like you're present in this conversation. You haven't just ducked out. You're not thinking about last week's shopping or next Monday's episode of Star Trek. You're actually focused in the here and the now. You're listening to them and you're showing them that you're listening. And it would be really helpful if you respond with great honesty. So for example, if you say something like, well, that's really shocking, well, I'm really shocked to hear that, that'll be really cool for that person, because you've been real with them. You see, what they experience is they experience something horrific. They experience this non-reality, this unreality. So here we are. Imagine this, right? Imagine the child is being raped in all sorts of ways you can't even conceive of, and then 2 hours later that child has picked themselves up, cleaned themselves off, put their clothes on, and found themselves sitting down to Sunday dinner, and maybe the rapist is sitting at the table with them. Now, if that's the case, that rapist is going to be talking to them like there's nothing wrong, pasta salt. What do you think of the beef today? It's nice, isn't it? They're going to talk to them really like that, yeah? So this does something horrific to that person, because they're experiencing a complete unvalidation and invalidation of their experience, because actually this person is acting like everything's normal, but something horrific only happened, what, 2 hours ago? And the only way that child can cope is they've split the two things off. So, and they've been threatened, of course, so they just, oh yeah, the beef's really good today, Dad, thanks very much. That's how they're responding, yeah? So when you, listening to your friend or loved one, and they've just opened up about this thing, if you can be real, that would help them so much. I'm very shocked to hear that. Wow, I can't imagine what that must have been. That's a really good line. If you want an opening line, I can't imagine what that must have been like, would be a good one, if you haven't. If you have, then you could say to them, actually, when I was this person, and what then happens is something remarkable. And this still happens to me today, because I've known about this since I was 38. Yeah, I've known about it for a while. And yet still, I was in a situation, I think a telephone interview with someone in America last week, and they were asking me questions about themselves. And right early on, about 2 minutes into the conversation, they mentioned that they had been sexually abused as a child. Now they did that because in my application form for their service, I'd had to give them all the details about my life that was significant and serious and, you know, heavy, difficult, challenging. So I mentioned it. So within 2 minutes she was in there with that. So this is what it meant to me. Instantly I knew I could trust this woman. Didn't know anything about her other than the fact that she had a product to sell which I was interested in. Didn't know nothing. All I knew was she'd had this experience, so instantly I trusted her. So if you have had the experience of being sexually abused, and someone you're sharing with is going to feel wonderful. You're going to feel safe. And I'm having another moment. I actually can't cope with making this film again. It's too difficult. Apologies. Back in a moment. Right. So this person is validating you, listening to you, and honouring you with their time and attention, and they're aware that you're probably carrying a lot of shame about this thing that happened to you. So here's the thing to grasp. This happened to me yesterday, and if you want more, about what I'm going to talk about now. Teal Swan's really good. She's really good, by the way. Trust her absolutely, obvious reasons. So I was sitting at a little birthday lunch situation, and I was with 3 people plus me. And at first I just sat down with everyone, and then someone was talking about something. I couldn't really understand what they were saying. It was a bit busy, a bit noisy in this restaurant. And then within about 2 minutes something happened to me. Now this happens to people who've been raped and otherwise abused, sexually abused as a child. This happens to them. It's very distressing. It's as if a glass window manifests between me and everybody else in the restaurant. 1 minute it's not there, next minute it's just manifested, and I feel like I'm behind this glass wall and I can't reach those people and they can't reach me. It's one of the loneliest feelings in the world. It's really tough. So this is something that people who've experienced this level of abuse it will happen to them quite often. And this brings me to the next subject, which is being triggered. So if you're in a close relationship with someone who's been sexually abused, what will happen is quite often your partner or friend, loved one or whatever, they will become triggered. Now when they become triggered, they are no longer with you. You might see their physical body sitting there. They might even have eye contact with you. They might even be answering questions you ask. But what I want you to understand is if they've been triggered, they're not there. They're in another place. They're somewhere else altogether. Right. People who've been in wars and civil unrest and life-threatening situations will tell you this. People who've been to these really big wars as war correspondents. War correspondents are kind of junkies, because it's such a disturbing experience. It heightens their consciousness to such an extent that when they're not being a war correspondent, life seems a bit bland and dull. When a guy's working as a Navy SEAL or some other high-powered big shot soldier, dude carrying big guns and shooting people up, all that kind of stuff, and when it stops, and he's walking around Tesco's buying milk, it feels a bit mundane. So for people who've had peak experiences, whether good peak experiences like climbing a mountain or winning a Grand Slam at tennis, or being in a war, or being repeatedly raped by an adult, this is a peak experience. So these really strong peak experiences feel more real than everyday life. So for people who've been sexually abused, what can happen is if something happens to threaten them in terms of... So let me give you a simple example. The Star Trek, the latest series, new season, Netflix, all the rest of it, the captain is in bed, he's had sex with the Admiral. I have to point out for you old Star Trek fans, this is 2017. This is what they do in 2017, yeah? The captain of Discovery been having sex with the Admiral. Get over that. So the Admiral's awake, the dude's fast asleep, captain's fast asleep, and she can see marks on his back which are scars where he was tortured very recently by Klingons. Stupid woman. Do you know what she does? The dude's asleep, she starts touching his scar. Duh. So what does the guy do? Of course he does what you'd expect him to do, having experienced torture. It's on the level of sexual abuse as a child, see? So what happened is he's got on top of this woman and he's got a phaser and it's set to kill, and if she does anything wrong, he's going to kill her. So that's an example of being triggered. So in the case, melodramatic Star Trek, the dude is so triggered because of his recent torture that because someone just touched the place where he was tortured, stupid Admiral, then of course he was fully triggered and went into life or death mode, which for him was to point a phaser at her. For those who don't watch Star Trek, it's a kind of lethal force gun, right? So getting back to the person, friend, loved one, something might have happened. So I'll give you an example, personal example. if someone starts to raise their voice and get angry with me, what I learned as a child is that when someone got angry with me, that meant I was either going to experience physical violence from my father or from the person who sexually did what they did, or I'm going to be raped, or I'm going to have a metal object inserted into me, or I'm going to have something even more horrific which I won't talk to you about because I will keep this a clean show, right? So this means that from the point of view of the person who just got pissed off and angry with me, so what's happened to him? So, well, what would happen? I'll tell you what would happen. The way that I survived as a child is that when anything really horrible happened, this is what I learnt. Shut up, be still as possible, not easy if someone's raping you, and become totally obedient and totally compliant. And of course just kind of check out and not be there, be somewhere else. So really not be there. So this is what happens to me. So I've had this experience in my life. Obviously, of course, people get angry with people, don't they? Stands to reason, obvious. But when someone gets angry with me, I kind of go into this other place. The glass panel is just erected between me and everything else. I can't reach everything. Everything can't reach me. I'm intensely lonely. And I'm not there anymore. And I'll be still and quiet and obedient. And it reminds me of a time which was a moment of being triggered. I was with a filmmaker protester and two policemen accosted us in an area fairly near where an event was going to take place, and the policeman asked me for my phone, and I really judged myself very harshly for this afterwards, because I became shocked and disturbed at my behaviour, because what I did, I was triggered, so I became silent and obedient and as still as possible. So without any sense of looking after myself or my own boundaries, I just handed my phone over. And that was hilarious, because it was a brand new phone. There was nothing on it that wouldn't have mattered even if he had, because I wasn't in that world of protesters. It didn't interest me. This was just my friend, you understand. But of course they didn't know that. They just knew I was with a known protest filmmaker. But what freaked me out, and to this day I feel a little bit horrified about, is the way I just was totally disempowered person. That disturbed me, because that trigger meant that I couldn't actually defend myself. All I could do is just be obedient and quiet. I really didn't like that about myself at that point. So that's another little thing. I have nothing to do with demonstrations about anything, no matter how I might agree with the subject. I don't go to demonstrations, because if I was to do so, I would simply become so triggered, I would go into that mode again, obedient, silent, and all the rest of it, no use to anyone. And that's a bit of a clue, isn't it? So here's the thing, it's a difficult subject, so I apologise, it's taken me so long to actually be able to make this film. So what I want you to understand is, if this person you are with becomes triggered, they might shut down in some way. I've described how I shut down. Or they might respond in a very extreme, excessive manner, like really over the top, defending themselves, like the guy, the captain in the Star Trek thing, when the woman just touched his back on his scar when he was sleeping. You know, these sorts of things. So if your person in your life who has experienced sexual abuse and they become triggered, what you'll notice, they'll behave in a weird manner that is not normal. That's the key that I'm asking you for you to look at. So if your person, loved one, behaves weird suddenly and you don't know what you did, just realise they've been triggered, which means there's a glass wall gone up between you and them, and they don't know what's going on anymore. They've gone to some other place where they feel safe. Because of course, and I shouldn't need to say this, but I will have to, because I can't assume you know anything, anyone who's experienced sexual abuse as a child, all they want to do all the time is to be safe. Wherever they are, whatever they're doing, they so want to be safe, because they've experienced a degree of unsafeness that you can't conceive of. Yeah. So if they go weird because they got triggered, then the most important thing to do is don't start judging them, don't have a go at them, don't get aggressive with them, don't do anything that's going to put fuel onto the flames. What you need to do is to recognize that person's been triggered, and just to be as calm as you can when they're in that state. Try not to react to whatever they're doing, and give them some time and some space. Now, it may be you won't be able to get through to them at all. That's very possible. Or if there's a chance of a bit of communication, you could say, what do you want? How can I help? Be aware they might not be able to answer you, but if they can answer you, if they say, I just want some space, go away and leave them alone. Don't argue, don't bullshit, don't whine, don't whinge, don't be an arsehole. Just give them what they wanted, right? If what they say is, please stay with me, but don't talk to me, then just shut up and be with them. Do you see where I'm coming from? At that moment, be aware that they are not there with you, because they are reliving a peak experience, just like the war correspondent, just like all the people who have been through these really life-threatening, life-changing experiences. At that time, that person's gone somewhere else. So if you give them the space and you can help them to feel safe, what will happen is they'll come back quite quickly. This glass wall that went up between them and everything else will actually just start to crumble into mist, and they'll start behaving normally again really quickly. And let's face it, this is your loved one or your friend or your partner, so that's what you want, isn't it? You want to love them, you want to help them, you don't want to make things worse, you don't want to put fuel on the fire, you don't want to fan the flames, you want to actually help them through this. So this is a really difficult thing to talk about next, but I'm going to talk about it. I have worked for 27 scary years with this. So for 27 scary years I've been aware that this is what happened to me as a child. For the years before then I didn't know, because the compartments had worked so well, the walls were so strong and thick, I hadn't a clue. I was just a functional person. In other words, I'd suffered abuse, but I was functional, didn't know. But ever since then I've known, and I've done so many things, so many therapists, so many practices on my own, with a therapist and in groups, 27 years, and still I can be triggered. So I'm going to do this largely for myself and partly for you. Let's really summarize the issues as I can remember them. Honor the person who's sharing with you about their abuse. Be aware they may be carrying a huge amount of shame, more than you can conceive of, even though it isn't their fault. Be aware that if you validate them, you'll make them feel better and open up and trust and love you. If you invalidate them in any way, they will just go away. They'll just check out and not be present. These people have got special powers, and they can get triggered easily. And when they get triggered, they go into this other place. It's as if there's a sheet of glass in front of them, and you can't reach them and they can't reach you. And in Teal Swan's words, this is the loneliest experience there is. And she gets pretty in your face about it, and she says, okay, imagine a whole load of people have just been bombed, or maybe they're starving in Africa. And she's saying, well, surely that's got to be the worst thing. Or maybe a whole load of people are all being tortured together, that's got to be the worst thing. No, sorry, this is Teal's opinion, and I've checked it out and she's right. Sorry. The worst experience actually is to have been sexually violated in some way as a child, and maybe some other things as well, and for that to have happened to you, and for them to have done the number on you whereby you've been threatened, so you can't ever talk about it, so you've had to compartmentalize everything so that whenever you get triggered, the wall of glass comes up, and at such a moment I'm completely alone and completely on my own. And there isn't anyone I can turn to, there isn't anyone I can talk to, because I'm scared. And there's no help. Because that's what I went through. That is the worst thing a human being can experience, to know that you're totally alone and that no one can help you. So if you've got a friend or a loved one, cut them some slack, make them some allowances for when they get a bit weird, and love them back. Because, as always, it's all about the love, and much love to you, and thanks for your patience for watching this.